Hello, everybody. This is a Male Space, and welcome back to another episode of the Mansplainers. I'm here with my co-host, Dr. Stephen Baskerville, and today we have our guest, Mike Richter of the Heroes Forge. Thank you for being with us, Mike.
Hey, thanks for having me, gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to meet you, Dr. Baskerville. I look very much forward to go ahead and speak on this amazing book that you've written for our learning and for our development. I go ahead and host the Heroes Forge here on YouTube, and you can follow me on X and other platforms as well. I primarily concern myself with masculine development from a Christian worldview. I think that there's much to be said about development of men, generally speaking, across the world, and I serve to develop men just a little bit more. And if I can go ahead and impact one life, that's one life that is made better off for it.
Well, thank you. It's very good to have you, Mike. We're very pleased to have our guest, Mike Richter, on the show today. I don't have a lot to say. I'm very flattered, of course, that it's my book, and I thank you for your kind words about that. Yes, thank you, Bradley. But I'll let you go ahead because I'm curious to know. Obviously, I'd like to know what the response is among people, especially if they like the book. So please take it away.
Absolutely. So I noticed that the publication date for this book was in 2021. Have you noticed any substantial changes in the world around us over the last 5 years that you would think to incorporate in a second edition of this book?
Well, I certainly can think, I always think of things that I should have incorporated in the book, and I would like to. I'm not sure about what's happened in the last 5 years. There's certainly been some changes, I think, in the manosphere. I tried to stay away from that too much in the book. I wanted it to be a book of more timeless, something that would endure. Rather than being a matter of news. So I didn't talk about the current events very much at all in the last few years. And I would probably do the same now. There's a lot of things that I would include in the book as there always are. That answers your question. Was
No,
there
it gives
something in particular you were thinking of?
Well, it gives perspective, right? Because the general thrust of the book is to be timeless by its nature. And I appreciate that in so many ways because I used it to have conversations with my older son and my older daughter about the world around us and times past and how things come back into relevance time and time again. And I was just curious because from my perspective, a lot has changed in the dating market since COVID era. And I would imagine that you would have more things to say about it from a mating and dating perspective, though I understand that is a relatively small piece of the overall work that you've provided.
My impression of the dating, and not being of the age to participate myself, but my impression of the dating market is that it's more or less in free fall. It's completely out of control. So I'm not sure how I would make sense of that. I did try to write a book that would be timely. I tried to update it's an old genre. It goes back to there were books like this being written they really took off in the Renaissance afterwards, but there were some even older. And I wanted something that would be relevant to men, especially young men today, given mostly the sexual revolution. That's the kind of larger context in which I tried to place it, which most versions of a book like that would not take into account. So that was the main thing. And I did kind of push it into some areas are not normally dealt with in advice books. As far as trying to sort out today's dating market, that would be a task that I think would almost be beyond me without some significant research.
It's fair. Now, for the benefit of viewers that may not have already read the book, could you go ahead and give a brief thesis of the work?
Like I say, it's an old genre. The books, advice books for men, go back to the Italian Renaissance. They were the Italian books, most famous, Castiglione's Book of the Courtier. These books were widely imitated in England, just to deal with the English-speaking world. And later in America, there was Eliot's Book of the Governor. There was the translation of Castiglione's book, which was very influential. Eliot's Book of the Governor, and then other books all through the 16th and 17th centuries. And later on, Chesterfield's book Lord Chesterfield in the 18th century, his letters to his son. These are advice books to men, often men working their way up through the ranks, not gentlemen or men aspiring to be gentlemen, men working their way up from the peasantry or the middle class. Less as families became upwardly mobile, they needed to learn the ways of comportment, behavior, how to deal with things like manners, how to deal with dating, how to deal with what was expected of a gentleman. The thing I'd really emphasize in the book, I'll just mention it now, we can come back to it later maybe, is ruling. A big part of it was to train the ruling class in the habits of how to, as I say, rule the world or to run the society. And this is something that I think men have lost today. They've been put on the defensive about being leaders. There's a lot of cliches about leaders and from the conservatives forth, but to be actual rulers, to rule the world is a masculine thing. I'm sorry, but it is. And it's something men are defensive about today, and they've lost those habits. So these are all it's all part of a package. It's not just nice table manners or how to tie a tie or dance a quadrille or mix a martini. It's those are the accoutrements, but there's a lot of substance to it, including how to behave in society, how to comport yourself, and how to deal with women and family life, how to interact with the society as a leader and a ruler.
Excellent. I think one of the best things about this book is that it is so broad in scope. When I think of old manuals on etiquette, they were far more narrow in their scope to dealing with general behaviors, how one introduces various peoples depending on the context of the situation and things like that. But you provided background for the purpose of education, what benefits religion has for the everyman, not just someone who is religiously inclined. You go through so many aspects of life in a relatively short amount of time. I think that that's really goes to show how well written it is, that there are so many elements that you can hit in broad strokes, but at the same time, give it a reasonable amount of depth per area. So I think you had organized it extremely well. Thank you for that.
Well, thank you. And that's what I tried to do. I tried to touch all the important themes. I didn't go into details on how to tie a tie or how to pass the dishes at a table, because nowadays, frankly, these things are available not only in other books, but on the internet. You can look it up in 2 minutes. So I did frequently tell gentlemen, here's the basics. And if you want the details, check the internet. And what you get there is often fairly reliable, but I try to warn men against the things that I think are absurd that they might run into. So that's how to discern good advice from bad advice. That's another one I try to talk about. But if you picked up exactly on my intentions.
Excellent. So one question that's really been burning since I read the book is, what do you make of the decision that many public school systems have made to integrate talent pools? So I find that when I went through public education, there was a stratification of different levels of talent, and they were cloistered with other students of similar talent areas. However, my younger brother and sister were coming up. They were seeking to integrate talent pools rather than segregate them. What do you make of that choice?
This is interesting. I'm not current trends in public education, since it's been so long since I've been there, or even my children were there. But this sounds like an egalitarian, an attempt at equalizing and moving away from what we used to call tracking, or what was the word? There was another word for it, where they would separate students, pupils of various abilities. And that, I guess that's out of fashion nowadays, not surprisingly, and they want to integrate everyone together and teach everybody the same thing. Well, this is something that has been, I guess it's been going on for some time. My model on public education has always been the old, before the recent reforms, since about the 1980s, but the old English school system, where you had public schools, which were elite schools. Then you had the grammar schools, which were government state schools, but they were also somewhat elite. And you had the secondary modern schools, which were basically students that did not intend to go to universities. And they were students that would probably not, this was before everyone was expected to go to university. The majority did not go to university in Britain for many years, or before that in America for quite a few years. It was the secondary moderns were the way of, for most students, the public school students who couldn't afford private schools would go to the grammar schools, and they got a pretty good, very good education often, and they could go to universities if they did well. And then, of course, you had the private schools, which would feed directly into the universities. And the surprising thing about this was what always struck me about the British system, and I think the American system is also true, even before I was in it, is how popular education was, how successful it was at educating so many people, and what seemed like a hierarchical, stratified, elitist system. Yet it managed far more popularization of knowledge than I think we were achieving at that time in America. I remember once in London, I was working in graduate school, I was working in my flat, and I was doing research on the Puritans. And an electrician came into my room to do some work on and he looked at the books on my desk and he started commenting on them. He said, I see you're reading a book about Richard Baxter. Oh, and Baxter's an interesting figure, he is. And he goes on and on. I'd never heard of Richard Baxter before I got into graduate school. And here he was, this electrician with certainly no university education, was telling me more about the man than I knew. And he looked at several of my books and did. This is the most amazing thing. It would take a while to explain why, but I think the anti-elitist, egalitarian trend in the schools is not only wrong, I think it's self-defeating. I think it tends to dumb down everyone to the same level, at the lowest level. Whereas the elite schools, the existence of elite schools, even if they only educate a few people, this, if you'll forgive the cliche, a trickle-down effect. Like a Mercedes-Benz. I would never have a Mercedes-Benz. I could never afford one. Even if I could have a Mercedes-Benz or a Rolls-Royce, I wouldn't have one. I don't even own a car. But I don't deny the importance of Rolls-Royces and Mercedes-Benz. They set a standard for everyone else. And that standard has an impact on the right down the line to the Volkswagens that I used to drive. I think it's a very short-sighted way of dealing with things.
It's interesting that you bring up cars as a model for this education system because it's so very true. I find that oftentimes luxury features in luxury vehicles end up becoming democratized over time as they become economically viable to provide to mass-produced vehicles. And I think in like manner, this is the same thing that happens in education a lot of times when you allow stratification to exist and to thrive.
I think there's a lot of truth in that. You've got to reward excellence and encourage excellence and quality. It's not to say that every student that goes to an English public school or to an Oxbridge or Ivy League university is smarter than the rest of us. They're not. I can assure you, they're not at all, for the most part. But you still need schools that have and standard that set the standard. And I think the difficult thing about this to accept is we have to put away our resentment. And there is a certain, these schools and these elitist, any institution, elitist institution, does breed resentment, or what we used to call envy. Why can't, who's this toff who owns a Mercedes-Benz when I can't even afford a Porsche? It's very hard to do that. We're all envious. We're all resentful of people who have more than we have, especially if they don't seem to earn it. It's a tendency we have to resist, I think.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that in the education section of your book, you list out various works of literature and fiction and nonfiction. And I find that during my education process in the schooling that I went through, I read through over half of those as required reading in secondary education. However, when I go ahead and look to my brother and sister, it was not a part of their curriculum, most of those books or anything in those veins. So that's what really led me to ask this question of you.
And if you look at the elite universities today and schools, they're not reading them there either. So chances are I had a course like that, a great books class where I was forced to read all these books this was in the late 70s. And I'm sure I got a better education in that secondary school, that high school. Ivy League students get today.
This is something that caused my wife and I to be convicted about providing our children a classical education and to expose them to many of these great works of literature along their education process.
Absolutely. And I'm a great fan of homeschooling for that reason. I taught in a college for many years that was fed by homeschoolers. Our students were homeschoolers, for the most part, homeschooled. I very much encourage that. Even if your children are in public schools, you should take an active interest in their education. Try to supplement it as much as you can. Don't take it for granted what they're getting. Even in a private school, don't take it for granted what they might be getting.
And I find that parental involvement in so many ways is a safeguard against many of the ills in our society. Because if a father takes it upon himself as leader of his household to ensure the orthodox beliefs of his children, they are much more likely to be better off with a holistic idea of what has been provided to them rather than just assuming that the institutions have your children's best interests at heart.
Absolutely, that's true. Now, the one caution I would make, we often hear that kind of thing. People say, especially conservatives, traditional conservatives say this, parents should take more interest. It's the parents' fault. Parents should take more interest in their children. Educate your children. Homeschool your children. Well, that's great advice if you have an intact family. If you have a single parent home, or you don't have a father because he's been thrown out by the family courts, then that's pretty hard for the father. And if he's not allowed to see his children but 2 days a week, Tuesday afternoon from 3:30 to 5, that's pretty hard to do much homeschooling or supervision of the education. So let's not assume that just because the parents are not hands-on, that they're falling down on the job. It may be beyond their control. So we need to address those kind of things also.
Absolutely. And if we see the level of pathology that tends to come from single mother households, it's no surprise that we have these ills, especially if the father does not have an adequate amount of time to be with his children to go ahead and show them the way that they ought to go through no fault of his own.
Right, very much so. And even though a lot of homeschoolers are mothers, those mothers need the leisure of a breadwinning father in the family so that they have the time and the leisure to not work and to educate the children. And then as the children get older, it's usually oftentimes the education passes from the mother to the father. And so for those reasons and more, the presence of a father is absolutely essential, or it's just one more way, as you say, that the children are effectively neglected.
Brad, I've been asking a bunch of questions. I feel like I'm being rude by not giving you an opportunity to ask Dr. Baskerville anything. Would you be so kind?
Okay, you're not being rude at all. I enjoy all this commentary. This is the commentary that I always look forward to and I'm always up for. So I appreciate firing with any questions, commentary. I'll go when I get the chance to fit in, but thank you for that. I'm a host. We're homeschoolers ourselves, my wife and I, and we have a certain setup in which we can do this. But the aspects of the book, and even it's in the title, is the term ruling the world. I am with you, meaning that, okay, fine. A lot of these conservatives and Republicans can say it's on the parent, it's on the parent. You don't want your children exposed to, let's say, bad material, nefarious material. Well, you have to take it upon yourself to get these parental guards in your home of all your electronics. But there's going to have to become a time where individual parents are not concerned with this, meaning if we were living in a functional society, we would not have these worries and this responsibility to homeschool or to track every sort of media that we consume. Isn't it going to be the time where we have to, like your title says, I think it's a good term, to rule the world as men, so that we do not need these pressures put upon us as individual families?
Very true. Yes, very true. In fact, if you look around at so many things nowadays, we're always trying to come up with gizmos and gadgets to protect our children,
Yes.
banning telephones or various forms of censorship to prevent bad influences from hurting our children. Whereas oftentimes these are solutions which we resort to because we don't have the courage to deal with the fatherhood crisis. So we come up with all kinds of gimmicks and gizmos, gadgets to protect our children. We come up with silly rules about bullying. I name a few of them in the book and in my other books. All kinds of problems like that rise from when the solution is much simpler. It's that the children need a father, not just a father, but a father with authority to supervise the household, to set the standards for his children's education, but also for their spiritual development, as you mentioned, Mike, and their moral development. So you can only plug the holes so many times, so many places. But in many ways, all those gimmicks we come up with for protecting children, the helicopter parenting, which is really helicopter mothering for the most part, keeping them in and preventing them from playing outdoors and preventing them from walking to school alone and all this kind of stuff. I didn't have to put up with that when I was growing up in the 60s and 70s because I had a father. And a father, he took care of me. He taught, first of all, if I acted like a bully, he would sort me out. If someone else was bullying me, he would either sort out the bully or he'd more likely teach me how to sort out the bully. But now we have anti-bullying laws, which is basically a way of single mothers protecting one another's children from the other's children. It doesn't work. It can't work.
Yes, there are limitations to this because, as Shah has been saying in some of our conversations, these are sort of, let's say, duct tapes to problems, meaning that we're not going to marry, we're going to cohabitate. We're not going to marry, we're going to go to the hospital and get custody at the time of birth to ensure that I'm the dad. When we have to fix marriage, we have to fix these institutions as men collectively rather than duct taping everything together. Does that make any sense?
It has the advantage of a kind of holistic approach, and that's what I obviously try to address in the book, is not just being a good father. There are already books like that, and frankly, some of them are kind of full of nonsense. But it's been not just a good father, but a good man, a gentleman, the old ideal of a gentleman, somewhat updated. You can't do it. You can't do with all those things. You just run out of, like you say, you run out of duct tape. It's an excellent metaphor.
Yes.
You run out of duct tape. Instead of the duct tape, you should have a man exercising authority in his home. That's kind of why I wrote the book, was because the book is, there's lots of more specialized books, how to have good manners, how to raise your children, how to be a man, how to be a good father, how to dress properly, these sorts of things. But all of these things go together. And that's the important point. And of course, religious belief, which we haven't touched on, which we did. All of these things are of a whole for the father and for the son and for the children and for the family as a whole.
That's interesting that you bring up the idea of men needing to collectively solve a lot of these problems. And I find that one of the issues that stands before us is within the religious realm in a lot of ways. You point out that there are a lot of religious institutions where if there's a woman that is a clergy person, it's probably not a great idea to be there. Totally agree. You also mentioned another category of people. You mentioned nominal men. So men that are often henpecked by their wives or in control by one way or another through their wives or through the various women of the church. I find that this is true amongst much of the church nowadays that it has been feminized and has been taken over as a gynocracy for the most part. What do you see, one, as key characteristics for a man who is entering a church to identify these nominal men, as you put them? And then, second, what collectively as men ought we do to bring about the required change so that we can be on more of a united front when handling these problems that require unified solutions?
This is a very important question because I believe that a lot of men, they've just deserted the churches. They've run away. This is well known. And they say, oh, the church is hopeless. The church is useless. They don't like men. They dump on men. They always take the woman's side. They even encourage the women to divorce the men sometimes. And the churches are useless. Well, all that's true. It's true. I can't put a we're going to have a guest at some point that will talk about exactly that. Edgington is his name. You may have heard of him.
Yes, I have. He's a great gentleman.
We're discussing that. He's going to send us copies of the book. This is all true. Yeah, there's no point in denying it. But as I maintain to men, if you can't take over a congregation, you're not going to take over a country or an entire civilization. So start with the churches. That's a good place to start. They have their doctrine, which is in theory, the Christian doctrine is very friendly to men and very exalts the importance of masculinity and fatherhood, fourth God the Father. The doctrine is there. The clergy are feminized. The congregations are feminized. The leadership is feminized. It's all true. I would go into it with illusions, of course. I would join the men's group. There's always the men's group. For the most part, they flagellate one another about their sins. They confess their sins. They talk about nothing but what a horrible man they are, what a horrible father they are. That's okay. That's fine. But they can also start talking about they're not horrible because they are too much of a man. They're horrible sometimes because they're not man enough. They're not horrible because they try to exercise leadership in their home and family and congregation. They're horrible because they don't exercise leadership enough. They're not horrible because they're abusive. They're horrible because they're too afraid of being called abusive. So your sins can be reinterpreted. Make sure if you're bewailing your sins, which is a good Christian practice, make sure you're bewailing the right sins for the right reasons, and not using repentance as a way of disguising your cowardice. Leadership is an imperative in the church. I would urge men to take a more aggressive. What's the line in Scripture? Wise as serpents, gentle as doves. There's time when you do have to be wise and you have to be bold, take leadership. The pastor is not, well, you say so. An old tradition, and especially in Protestant congregations, at the birth of Protestantism, that's what people were doing in Catholic congregations. The Protestants were dissatisfied with the worship, frankly, sometimes quite effeminate worship of the Catholic Church. And they went into the congregations, into the Catholic parishes, and they said so. And they ridiculed the preachers, and they instead of hoc est corpus, they said hocus pocus. Frankly, the Puritans, some extremists were known to actually urinate on altars, which I don't endorse, needless to say. But they certainly desecrated them. They certainly desecrated, whether you think the Catholic Church deserved that or not. My point is, all the churches kind of deserve it today, including the Protestant churches. So this is an old tradition in evangelical worship of rebelling against the preachers, the clergy that don't do their jobs, and allow the congregations to fall into the hands of women. So I would be bold and not hesitant to assert yourself.
I think it's interesting because in my congregation, I recently had been appointed to be a deacon, and in the first year as I served as a deacon, there was another deacon that was serving as a head deacon, first among equals at that position tier, and he was more of an egalitarian mindset, and I'm more of a patriarchy mindset, and we got into it once where he had mentioned something offhand comment on a Wednesday night Bible study about mutual submission. And I'm like, where do you find that? And he's like, oh, well, it's in Ephesians 5. And I go ahead and read it. And I ask for a moment of his time off in private because this is how we handle matters as gentlemen. I'm not going to go ahead and put him on blast in front of the congregation. I said, the thing that you had referenced does not mean what you say it means. And the context will go ahead and give a different picture. And he immediately got defensive because he was not prepared to defend that viewpoint. Right? He had just looked it up on Google really quickly. It didn't come from any doctrinal or any grounded doctrinal work that he had done to establish that point of view. He allowed his doctrine to be influenced by his cultural leanings rather than letting his cultural leanings be influenced by sound doctrine. We got into it. We had to go to the elders, the next tier up, to go ahead and have a conversation on the matter. And I was well prepared, and I had communicated with other members that had been on my tier. And it was found that there's nothing wrong with the way that I handle my family. And there are concerns about what he had been talking about. there are times to stand up for the things that are right and to handle it like a gentleman so that you have less angles of attack upon you.
Let me also say something here about religion and church attendance for the men who are not believers, because I do address this in the book. And I think it's extremely important that every man, even if he's not a Christian or not a believer at all, needs to be familiar and I think needs to go to church and needs to be a leader there. And there's several reasons for this. And there's actually many reasons, but I'll just mention a couple. One is no man you raised the issue of education, but no man can consider himself educated if he isn't familiar with the Bible. Even my father, who was an atheist, taught me that, and I was an atheist for many years. And he made it a point of making sure that I understood the Bible because it's the most influential book in human history, and you can't possibly believe it or not, you can't consider yourself an educated man if you aren't familiar with the Bible, like the Greek and Roman classics and forth. It's absolutely essential. Secondly, churches are an institution in which men have great opportunity to be leaders. This is especially true in America, but it's true throughout the Western world. Churches are not just places of worship or even pretty places with flowers and things to get married. Churches are civic institutions. They always have been. What became the United States was founded by churches. The Puritans who left England came to Massachusetts. They came in entire churches came together and they settled New England, and those churches became towns. And those towns, the worship of those churches became the famous New England town meetings with perhaps the purest form of participatory democracy in the modern world. And those churches in England, they were leading a revolution at the time of the exodus to America. The ones who didn't come to America instigated a revolution in England in the 1640s. Those who did come to America instigated a revolution in the next century in the American Revolution, which was, by the way, it was led by men by Jefferson, deists like Jefferson, and Adams was a Christian, but and Hamilton forth. But on the grassroots level, the American Revolution was driven by Christian activists. The people that agitated on the popular level of the American Revolution were neo-Puritan Christian activists. This was also true of the anti-slavery movement. It was true of the working class movements of the 19th century and the trade union movements. They were all cast in the language of evangelical Protestantism. So churches have always been civic institutions. I even say in the book, get involved in the church, read the Bible, go to church, be a leader. You don't even have to believe it. I think eventually, if you do it well, you will believe it. You will see the logic behind it. You will come to realize that there's good reasons to believe it. But I didn't at first. I studied religion as an academic for years and years. I was not a believer. I quickly came to the conclusion that the most important thing in any society is its religion. I still believe that. The most important feature determining the success of a society is its religion. And it took me many years to get myself, because believing religion is not easy. It's actually very difficult. Anybody who says, I believe in God, is putting the wool over your eyes. Because if anybody who believes Christianity or Judaism or Islam, and probably the others as well, it's one of the most difficult things in the world to believe. So you don't have to start out and I don't believe in God. It's not a good excuse. Work at it and be a leader. It's really, frankly, miraculous. What it can affect. And this is another thing. One of the things people always do when they want to reform societies, they want to start new organizations. Let's start a new men's group, or not a new men's organization. Let's start a lobbying group or a litigation group. Well, fine, but they very seldom succeed. They're usually hijacked by some leader, for either political or financial reasons. Churches are already there. They already exist. All you have to do is move in and get control of them. That's a worthy thing to do, to move in, get control of them, and hold their feet to the fire.
It sounds like you're advocating the reverse long march through the institutions. Is that more or less the case?
I suppose it is, in a way, marching back through the institutions, marching through the institutions that we've surrendered and we've abandoned. I suppose it is, because the left, that's what they did. And the left, by the way, comes out of religion also. By the way, the left is basically a form of secularized religion. So if anything, they've learned the lessons of Protestantism and Puritanism better than the right has, and they've applied them. And I think in many ways that's how they succeeded.
Well, I appreciate you putting it like that, Mike, because in our Roger Devlin, he said that in a revolution, the people who are the most energized and intelligent, and he used the word ruthless, are the ones who win. Perhaps the word ruthless would not apply to the men's movement. Perhaps it can. But wouldn't a counter-revolution, I agree that the counter-revolution would involve marching through the institutions.
And I think it's interesting because you mentioned ruthless and you kind of like step away from that word, but I think that's an appropriate word because it's a matter of determining one's convictions and fighting tooth and nail to defend and to promote one's convictions. I think that there is no dishonor in doing that and doing it well.
No, I would agree with that. That's a tone I tried to strike in the book is you can only persuade people to a point. Persuading people is nice, elections, pamphleteering or whatever, but at some point you have to act. You have to act, and you have to act boldly. And that's what men have to do. They have to, there's a place for democracy, there's a place for persuasion, but there's also a time for action. I think men need to accept that. That doesn't mean they have to be violent, but it means they have to be, as you say, bold and sometimes a bit ruthless.
It's interesting that you bring up the idea of democracy. And in a lot of ways, it seems that our modern society is almost addicted to the idea of democracy. What do you make of the difference between universal suffrage versus a form of limited or qualified suffrage? What do you think is better for a society, generally speaking?
Well, that's a good question. In the early American Republic, there was no universal suffrage. There was a property qualification. You had to have, what was it? In England, it was a 40-shilling freehold. Propertyless, women could not vote, of course, slaves could not vote, but propertyless men also could not vote. Derelicts couldn't vote, paupers couldn't vote, and others. And there was a reason for this. And if you trace it back, the vote was restricted to property holders because the vote was a household vote. It was exercised by the man on behalf of the family, and he was expected to have enough freehold property. That is to say, he wasn't dependent on anyone else for his livelihood. Even wage laborers were looked down upon as because they depended on someone else and they would vote the way their employer expected them to vote. Or the patron, under a feudal system, the vassals would vote the way their, if they voted, which they didn't, but if they had, or neo-feudal system, then the vassals would vote the way their lords told them to vote. So you had to have freehold property to be free. You had to have your own property, the best form of which was land. And then you could be truly independent. You could vote your conscience, you could vote wisely, and not the way somebody told you to vote. So this was so the vote, the citizenship was not just limited to men; it was limited to men pretty much married men in families, men with property, and that was the ideal of republic. It was not democracy exactly; it was republicanism. The ideology, if you like, that the American Revolution was fought on. This republican idea that men of proven virtue and not an aristocracy of wealth necessarily, but an aristocracy of virtue, and with a minimal amount of landed wealth was good. And this was the way. And if you look at places like Virginia, the Middle Atlantic states that produced so many presidents, so many leaders in the Revolution, it was the class of gentry, not the aristocrats, not the upper levels, not the very wealthiest, but the gentry, men who had, these were the second sons of the English gentry. They would come over and they would settle Virginia and Middle Atlantic states. And they were the ones who had, they were men of substance. They had land, they had certain wealth and independence, and they ran local government. They were gentlemen. They were the kind of men who would have understood what's in my book. And they were the men who ran local government. And they ran local government in the English shires. And then they ran it in the localities in states like Virginia, Maryland, North Carolina. And they had gotten in the habit of ruling their local society. They served as magistrates, they served as justices of the peace, they served as judicial officers. And when the American Revolution came along, they were habituated to being rulers. They knew what being a ruler meant. They had learned it from their ancestors in England. They had learned it from their fathers who came over and settled the Middle Atlantic states. And they were habituated to this. They know how to do it. This is where the idea of a certain modicum of landed wealth, and then this considered continued even in a Democrat. And Jefferson was a Democrat, but he was never a socialist. He believed land should be distributed more equally. More men should have land so that they too could be independent yeomen, was the term used, yeomen, and free thinking and not dependent upon others. The ideal of democracy was never so throwing the floodgates open for any man or woman to vote whatever pops into their head that morning is it is dangerous. There's no doubt about it. It's dangerous. And that's where the machines, when we did it, what happened? The machines came about. The machines, exactly what the founding fathers feared, was the machines. The bosses, the political bosses in the big cities and in states like Virginia in the South, they would control the votes of thousands, tens of thousands, millions of people. Because what happened? You'd get these immigrants off the boat from Lithuania or Ireland or Italy, or up from the South, migrants up from the South, and they moved into the cities, and they didn't care about ideals, about democracy and freedom and representative government. They just wanted a roof over their head and a job. Who would give it to them? Well, the urban bosses gave it to them. So they created these patronage machines. And that's what we have to, that's what the welfare system is today. It's a patronage machine where people vote according to who pays the check. And the paycheck comes from Uncle Sam. It is, you're right, it is something to be concerned about, this idea. Somehow, that's a difficult one, how to recapture that. But they would have been aghast at the idea of every individual, men, women, and children. Now in Britain, they want to reduce the voting age to 16. So it's going to be not just men and women, but it's going to be children that are going to start voting as well. And that's the end of democracy. There's no doubt about it.
I think that's interesting how they're seeking to go ahead and reduce the voting age to 16, but they're going to keep the age of consent still at 18. Well, if they are old enough to vote on matters of public defense and who's to represent them in the House of Commons, then should they not also have the ability to decide things like whether they're to consume tobacco or alcohol and things of that nature? It's insane to me that they're going to decouple that for the sake of enfranchising more people when the necessary consequence of enfranchising more people that have less of a holistic view of how governance is to be done, we're going to end up with more and more of what we already have, which is a sprawling state that is self-perpetuating.
What you just said reminds me of something, another important principle connected there. And that is, I remember when we gave the vote to 18-year-olds back when I was young, it was the motto, the slogan was, if they're old enough to fight, they're old enough to vote. It was during Vietnam. And that was actually a fairly sound principle because historically, another ideal, the part of the Republican ideal, was that the citizen was the citizen in arms. You only had the right to vote if you served in the local militia, if you served to defend your country and your community and your family in arms. And in a militia, it was you supplied your own weapons. And you, well, of course, the militia ideal was also part of the American Revolution, wasn't it? The idea of, I think we've lost something. I think when we went to a professional army. And of course, this is one reason, some feminists were aware of this. And this is one reason they wanted women in the military, because they knew very well that historically, full citizenship only came with service to one's country. And again, this is an old idea. It goes back to the English Civil War period. It goes back to the Italian Renaissance. It goes back to feudalism to some extent. It goes back to the ancient world. The idea that anybody could vote without serving in arms would have been considered ludicrous. So the feminists managed to get nominal numbers of women into the armed forces, mostly as lawyers and clerks. But to try and obviate this argument. But that might be one way, those who are pushing to repeal the 19th Amendment. I think a logical way of having the similar effect might be to require men who want to vote, who want the voting franchise, to serve in the military, which, as I mentioned in the book, is a healthy thing for men to do anyway. Men should. I come from a whole generation of men during the Vietnam War, and those a little older than me, who did not consciously evaded the draft, evaded military service. And we considered it a virtue. We were virtuous for doing so. But I think we lost something also in the process.
Yes.
That makes
if nothing else, our self-respect. What's the famous quote from Samuel Johnson? Every man despises himself that he was not a soldier.
Yes. And I agree with that. I'd like to take it in this direction here, because what I appreciate about this commentary that we have going here is that much of this is action-oriented, bettering ourselves as individuals and bettering the society around us. What I see in some of the online commentary in the spaces online is this sort of attitude that because things are declining and out of control, that we're going to so-called enjoy the decline, that men are going to have no restraint and indulge in hedonism. And as Dr. Baskerville, this is one of the areas that I have mentioned several times, is this indulgence to embark on sexual hedonism. And also in your book, there is a section on getting this under control and acting with more restraint here. And as we've been discussing here about when we comment about the welfare state, the sexual revolution, the importance of this restraint and how the lack of it can make someone a target, victims of what we're trying to fight against, such as the all sorts of allegations against men, meaning that when men indulge in this hedonism, there are serious consequences to it.
Very true. I think you've really touched there. I suppose really that probably is the single most important thing driving me to write the book. I'd previously written a book about the injustices of family courts and the divorce machinery. So I was well versed and in the injustices, the corruption And the things which I still regard as the most serious injustices against men is the family law system and the divorce courts. And then I'd written a second book expanding that out into the whole sexual revolution, showing, again, more injustices, mostly against men, not always, but mostly against men in false accusations of in the new politics of sex, where I showed the larger injustices, false accusations of various things, and the whole the child support system, and again, injustices against men, things that men complained about, things of which men were, I think, genuinely speaking, victims. But at some point, I came to realize that this can only go so far. You can only expose the injustices. At some point, you have to look at the men themselves and see, what are they doing about this? What are they, and what's stopping them from rising up? And because they are victims of injustice, there's no doubt about that. But that's not good enough. You can't just whine and cry and expect someone to rescue you from the railroad tracks. At some point, you have to grasp the nettle and start acting on your own behalf. So I tried to, and the more I thought about it, the more I realized one thing led to another, and I realized that it wasn't just inertia, it wasn't just hedonism, it wasn't just laziness, it wasn't just cowardice. It was all those things plus a lot more. It was all those. We'd lost that overall ideal of the gentleman, the idea of the man as a leader in the community, in the home, in the family, in the state, in the world. And in order to recapture that, you had to look at everything. You had to go back and recapture that entire ideal, going back to the gentry class that made the English and American revolutions, that founded the United States, that made modern Britain, that made modern Europe, that made some of the most successful societies on earth, and that other societies are also trying to recapture. If you look at the Islamic world today or the Hindu world, you might not, whether you sympathize with those religions or not, or worldviews, they are trying to recapture masculinity. And it's a big theme in all religious beliefs and all societies outside of the West. I think we need to recapture that. I think our version is the best one, the version of the West. I think the version of the Anglosphere, the English-speaking world, is also the best. But that's just my opinion. I'm not dogmatic about that. There are French versions, there are Italian versions. I'm sure there are many others. I know there's German ones. This is my attempt to look at the more subjective side of it, not just dwell on the injustices and the corruption and all the things that make us victims, but what we can do about it ourselves.
I think it's interesting, Brad, that you bring up this idea of sexual license in so many ways. And you bring up the idea of the need for increased sexual restraint. I find that the need for increased sexual restraint is really limited to those that do not naturally have it as a matter of how they conduct themselves. For example, many people in the lower crust do not really have problems with sexual restraint because they have no access in the first place to a legitimate means to express themselves sexually in a lot of ways. They're not picked and partnered with for marriage. And those in the slightly above average tier that do get married, it's much easier for them to exercise restraint because they have a proper course and they have a measured and moderated amount of sexual access. Whereas those at the very upper crust, I find, is the ones that would require more sexual restraint because they have such rampant access to it. And what's interesting is I find that the idea of men banding together is good, but we have so many men that are whining and complaining and not being willing to take up their measure of the work and participate in the work itself. Find that men often fail to realize that they are compensated at a level commensurate with the level of problems they are willing to solve and tackle, and that they are competent enough to solve and tackle. Men that do not have elevated levels of competency and elevated levels of ability to do these things would be best served finding elements where they can participate in the problem-solving activities of other men. But I find that all too often, many men that are not selected for mating and coupling and things of that nature, rather than finding a handhold on the millstone of the work to go ahead and grind the wheat, so to speak, they are keeping their hands off and they're saying, the juice isn't worth the squeeze. I'm not going to do anything. I'm not going to take on my responsibility because what is the benefit to me? The big challenge I find in a lot of ways is to encourage those men to take up their measure of the work and participate in the problem-solving efforts of others. What do you gentlemen think about that?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's absolutely true. I think every man, when I say that it's a man's calling to rule the world, I of course mean his little corner of it. Every man, none of us are going to rule the entire world. Every man has, this is the Christian idea of the calling, which the Puritans were very big on. Every man has a sphere within he is the leader, he is the boss, he's the ruler, whether it's just his family or his local community or his state or county or his nation. So I think you're right that the initiative generally does come from the top, and the apathy also comes from the top. If the prominent, affluent, educated influential men aren't doing anything, and they're not, then it's pretty hard to expect the men with less affluence, less education, less opportunity to take the lead. So I think that's very important.
I think it's interesting that we talk about how there's apathy on both sides of the extremes, where there's apathy on the lower crust and apathy on the upper crust. And it's interesting that in many ways, the upper crust has established monogamy as the norm for society, for the proliferation of economic output and benefit. And in a lot of ways, because there is a mismatch in mate quality and in inflation of certain qualities and deflation of other qualities, that this imbalance has caused it to have this idea of monogamy breaking down in a lot of ways. We see fewer people coupling up for life, for a collective purpose, for a unifying goal, and we see more people going it alone, whether temporarily or permanently, where they get married for a short period of time, have offspring, and then use the divorce ringer to go ahead and become independent, even though they are fully dependent on the income of the man in a lot of ways. And we see the decline in people choosing marriage as a lifelong calling. What do you gentlemen think about that?
I think that's absolutely true. I can certainly understand why men want to check out, for example, of the relationships with women and dating and marriage and childbearing. I'm not hostile to the MGTOW movement, the men going their own way. I think it's sad, and I think it should not be adopted as a permanent choice. I think it should be a means to an end. But I certainly understand. The one thing I would say to them, the men who want to check out, as you described it, what Trotsky is credited with saying about the Russian Revolution: you may not be interested in the revolution, but the revolution is interested in you. Feminists may not. You may think that you can protect yourself by hiding, keeping your head down, and staying away from women, staying away from marriage, dating, and the feminists won't get you. But I think they will. There's a very good chance that they will. I read a piece. There was a piece in today's Times today or yesterday, which said that they found a man guilty. His wife committed suicide, and he was guilty of what they called culpable homicide. In other words, not murder, not assault, not anything physical. Allegedly so psychologically abusive that he drove her to suicide, even though they don't have any specific thing. The newspaper article, I only know what I read in the article, but there was nothing, no specific illegal act that he had committed, no breach of the law, other than to be unpleasant with his wife, allegedly. So he was guilty of her, he was guilty of culpable homicide because she took her own life. My point here is that they're constantly looking for ways to criminalize men. This was a theme of my second book, The New Politics of Sex, was all of the different ways they have of creating criminals, especially men, and that they're always looking for new ways to find men guilty of something. You might think you can keep your head down. You might think you're safe if you just withdraw from the world, but I'm not sure that you are.
I see that too. Well, what you said is true, all of it, but it seems that no matter what status a man is, what status men are, that all the way from so-called elite men to ordinary men are constantly getting in trouble. You open up the newspaper these days or go online, you're going to find a celebrity man or some type of man of high status being accused of something. And it even happened to a man of high status. I don't recall, maybe I should have looked this up before I got here, but there is another case going on right now of a man alleged to have been abusive to a woman. We don't know, that's an allegation, but it seems that no matter what kind of man someone is, whether he's Chad or someone else, there is someone interested in getting these men in trouble. And also with with MGTOW, I am sympathetic to MGTOW. There are valid reasons to be I guess you would call it a MGTOWer or a MGTOW man. Obviously, the divorce regime and the sexual market these days, one can reasonably say, well, this is not worth it. There is too much. What's the saying? The juice is not worth the squeeze. But that's where it gets me into this conundrum constantly with what I'm constantly bringing up with Dr. Baskerville, Shah, and yourself, is that if there is no marriage, there are no fathers. There are no families without marriage. So we're kind of stuck in this sort of catch-22 here. I mean, if someone wants to be a father, you have to marry. That's what a marriage is for. So what are we going to do? Just simply constantly avoid marriage, avoid dating? Or some others will say, well, we shouldn't avoid contact with women. I'm the sort of MGTOW guy who uses women as recreational use. Well, using women as recreational use, I have a very dim view on this attitude. And that sort of, again, I'm going to go back to the hedonism mentioned in the book again. That sort of hedonism and that kind of attitude creates the problems that we're talking about here. That's what creates the welfare state. That's what creates children out of wedlock. That's what creates the problems that could result in that. A woman that a man sleeps with can turn around and say that something happened that didn't.
Do you think that that's the tail wagging the dog in that case? It seems to me that much of the sexual revolution came first, and the results were the things that you were mentioning, rather than the results being the antecedent.
Yes, but I don't. Why would no one's forcing men to participate in this sort of sexual license? No one's saying you must use women for recreational use. You don't. No one has.
No,
Yeah.
no, but I can say that from my generation onward, it was very tempting. The men, the initial promise of the sexual revolution in the 60s, there was the free love, the free sex. And this sucked men into it. There was the Playboy culture starting in the 50s. The men were the mini skirts and all that. And men were pulled into this. And then they were clobbered. It was a honey trap. It was a honey trap like the French Revolution, I compare it to, where they first you get the rights of man and then the freedom, and then you get the reign of terror.
Yes.
Having sucked the men into the hedonism, the free love, the sex, the breaking all the rules, having fun, what did they do? They started lowering the boom, the accusations of sexual harassment, sexual abuse, sexual assault, sexual this and sexual that, the sexual crime, the gender crimes. You're right, they didn't have to. But nowadays, now we have no excuse. I think looking back, we need to be aware of this, that the honey trap was bait. It was bait and it was very dangerous. You indulge in that kind of hedonism and you get what you deserve. I think we need to be very conscious of
this whole thing was sold to the average man as something to be beneficial to them. By design, it was really beneficial primarily to the elite and not to the average man. And the average man is now bearing the brunt of the consequences for this.
Very true. In fact, one of the observations I make in that book, and this is very important, vices, it's long been known that vices that seem harmless among the upper classes, social drinking, recreational drug use, out of wedlock sex. It's one thing for middle class people to indulge in this, educated, affluent people. They can do it, or at least they can seem to do it for a while without destroying their lives. When these things trickle down to the strata of society that are less affluent, less educated, they become devastating. So social drinking in the ghetto becomes chronic alcoholism. Drug use becomes, well, we know what recreational drug use has become among the poor, among the less affluent, crack cocaine and all the rest. And out of wedlock sex is the same thing. When you have sex, it's one thing for middle class, upper class people to have a baby without getting married. But what do we have? We have this chronic problem of fatherlessness, which really became an epidemic among the poor in the ghettos and the welfare classes. But now it also is spreading back up to the middle class. So all of these things, by the way, I would also add socialism to that as well. Socialism sounds really great in affluent European countries, but when it's practiced in Africa, it leads to nothing but disaster. So the affluent and the educated have a lot to answer for. They can do a lot for good and they can do a lot for ill. And they need to be aware of the consequences. It's not just setting a good example. It's a matter of affluent people need to be on their best behavior and inculcate that on the people who don't have time or leisure to read a book like mine.
Yes. And I'm also going to not portray myself as someone perfect because, again, what you two mentioned here is that it is sort of a honey trap when someone like myself was raised in the late Gen X era. Every year of my teenage years was in the 90s. And I'm not going to say that I'm perfect and I have not indulged in some casual activity. For example, when I discovered those websites before the apps, the websites like Match.com, those sorts of things, my friends and I were doing all sorts of things that I, looking back now, would say was unwise. So it is extremely tempting, and I'm not going to say that it's not. It seriously is. But what I liked you said in your book here is that even male spaces, for example, gentlemen's clubs, they were places where men could get a respite from the pressures of life to becoming places where where we went from that to being around men, relaxing or socializing with other men, to places in which we were expressing lewdness to women. And I like that you use that term in your book, Who Lost America? We are all women now, because it seems that much of the content in the manosphere is dedicated to discussing and complaining about women and also discussing ways in order to get women. But I guess I covered that also in what I just said before. I just wanted to throw that out there because I like the way that you put that before. Yes.
Oh, I was just going to go ahead and make commentary on your mention of socialism and how it works so well in Europe, supposedly, and it works relatively poorly in some place like Africa. I would say that it looks good on the surface in Europe. Problem with it is that much of its defense spending is subsidized by the United States. So in many ways, they are not bearing the true cost of socialism because they are they're putting the responsibility of a united defense on the United States in many ways, and then coming at us and pathologizing us for the way that we handle ourselves on the world stage.
Very much so. And I think this is destroying Europe in the process. I maintain that the reason the Europeans don't have independent foreign policies is because they don't have independent armies. They're toadies to the United States. They followed the United States slavishly. They followed the United States into the Ukraine war. And now that the United States is leaving it, they can't follow the United States out. So I maintain that a country with an army is a patriarchy, and a country with a welfare state is a matriarchy. And Europe seems to have chosen the way of matriarchies. And the United States, well, it's possibly going in the same direction. Something doesn't happen to check that trend, if we don't become aware of it, at least. I recently wrote an article about Europe's feminine foreign policy. If you don't have an army, you abdicate your foreign policy to the European Union. Who runs the European Union these days? It's entirely women.
Well, it's interesting because Ronald Reagan often said that it's best to speak loudly and to carry a big stick. Well, the European nations have no big stick to wave at people.
Yeah, it'd be nice if they could. Well, I won't go into the Iran war. It's another matter. But
Sure.
If they want an independent foreign policy, they've got to have an army. That's if Europe wants to resuscitate its place in the world. It's got to, and not a European army, an army commanded by Ursula von der Leyen, who destroyed Germany's army when she was defense secretary. An army in each different European country needs to have its own army under its own sovereign authority.
I've got a question that's going to be a little bit of a gear change compared to the current topic we're on. Do you have recommendations for either parents or grandparents regarding coupling of their sons and grandsons or daughters and granddaughters? Because I have concerns for deficiencies regarding the romantic model of marriage in a lot of ways. It seems that it has not served us well, and parental involvement once was a safeguard for sound coupling between a husband and a wife, and we don't see that as much nowadays. What are some prescriptions that you might provide to parents and grandparents in these matters?
Yeah, I do talk about that in the book a little bit. It's the recovery of courtship and the shift from courtship, which was controlled by parents, to dating, which is controlled by couple themselves, and then from there to dating apps, which is controlled mostly by women. Parents, assuming you have an intact family, which is not a valid assumption very often, but assuming you have parents that are more or less intact, and grandparents, they need to assert control, because marriage is historically a union of two families, not of two individuals. And it's very, marriage is more likely to be successful, but depending on the attitudes of the couple rather than their compatibility. Marriages were arranged for centuries. They still are in parts of the world, among not only the upper classes, but also among peasants. And oftentimes those arranged marriages are far more successful than the marriages so-called marriages out of love. The families need to be involved. How do you recover that? When I taught in a homeschool college, I did see families that still did that. The man would ask the father's permission to court the daughter. Not just to marry her, but to court her, to start a relationship. So it does exist. These are Christian families. It is possible. It's not completely disappeared. These things can be recovered, but it's not easy.
I think the reason why I asked this question is because relative to the general quality of women available on the market today, I believe that my daughters are going to be exceptional, and I want to go ahead and make sure that they can have exceptional mates with whom they can pair. And I have concerns about that. And then on my son's part, my two sons, they are genetically superior to me in many ways because I married a very tall woman. So my 14-year-old son is already 3 inches taller than I am, and he is slated to be well into 6 feet. I don't have concerns over that, and he has got a much better head start in his life than I had in my own. I grew up in poverty, and my son is growing up in the lower levels of American aristocracy in a lot of ways. So he's got a better head start. So I'm less concerned for the economic piece, but more concerned in how am I going to find an appropriate mate for my sons so that they're not having to go ahead and play Russian roulette out in this market.
That's a very good question. You and parents like you should certainly stay involved with both your sons and your daughters and help them select mates. And I think equally important is going into it with the right attitude themselves, and mates with the right attitude as well. Not just commonality of interests or similarities of personality, but similarities of belief. I think Christian faith seems to have a big role in that. If it's sincere, Christians get divorced as much as anybody, at least professing ones. It's hard to say if it's sincere, if they truly don't believe in things like divorce and farming out family authority to government officials. Those principles are very sound. By all means, stay involved as much as you can. I'm sure it's difficult, even for involved parents like you with traditional values. It can't be easy.
Appreciate your words on that, sir.
Vetting possible suitors for our daughters or our sons. Yes, this is actually a big area of interest for me, actually. Yes, I have brought it up to pretty much everybody I've spoken to in this space. Dr. Baskerville, you, Shah. Sometimes if you even mentioned arranged marriages to people, even other men, they will look at me as if I'm actually as if I'm nuts. Like whether I've mentioned it on a forum or a social media account, or people look down upon that a lot. But I have the same interest in it also. I'm very concerned about this. And that's for personal reasons as well, because I've noticed firsthand this sort of utter chaos that we have in the so-called dating market, or what we call the sexual market today. So Dr. Baskerville, you gave sound advice here, but I think that we're just going to have to be very careful, inculcate our children with the values that we have and what to look for in a mate. Another area that I personally am sensitive towards is that men these days do not have the authority they once did to protect their daughters from the wrong men. And I've seen where that goes also firsthand. No story is needed. It winds up very bad in some cases, yes.
Dr. Baskerville, you went ahead and really pointed this out very well when you were talking about love and marriage, and how authority in the home primarily stems from respect. That is the primary virtue, that if you were to want a solid, strong household, that you would want the wife to express respect to the husband. Without respect, and given our current societal landscape, authority is not a matter of law that a man can go ahead and express over his household as it was in times past. Now it stems from his ability to lead his family well and to collect the respect of his wife, so that he can make a call that may not be popular with her at the time, but she can go ahead and come and grow to respect the man for being willing to make calls that put him in temporary discomfort for the sake of long-term benefit.
No, I think that's very true. I think, as I recall, what I say is that respect and authority are what's important for a man, not being liked, not being loved. It's the essence of a man, I think, in many ways, to be willing to be hated in some circumstances. It's not something you should encourage or cultivate, but there are circumstances where a man has to be willing to be hated or disliked for the decisions and the positions and the authority that he exercises. It's the essence, I think, of femininity, to inspire love. And women, if you find that a theme in feminine literature and feminine culture, is the desire to be loved. They express it all the time. A man cannot worry too much about being loved. He has to be willing in some circumstances to be hated, but he does need respect and he needs authority to do what may be unpopular even within his own household. So that's the difference. It's the difference between ruling the household of women. We recently viewed a psychologist of a sort, Howard Schwartz, who said that the woman, in turn, in the children, the mother, then bestows unconditional love on the children. It's the essence of motherhood, is that the love of a mother is unconditional, but the love of a father is not necessarily unconditional. Fathers express disapproval. Fathers expect set rules. Fathers expect standards. They expect certain behavior. It's part of the process of growing up, is to leave the womb, leave that unconditional love, and identify with a father who demands rules and obedience and achievements and acceptance. These are inescapable differences between men and women, between fathers and mothers in the household. So I think you're right. It's a matter of respect. We also, just to point out just a point about my book, which I think is important. People often say that about clothing. When you talk about dressing well, men should wear a coat and tie, put away the jeans and the hoodies and that. And the cliche is that if you dress well, you're showing respect for other people around you. And that's true. There's no doubt about it. It's a cliche. But what you're also doing when you dress well is you are showing you're a man, because good clothing, the more formal your clothing, the more gender specific it is, right? When you wear a t-shirt or a hoodie and a pair of jeans, you could be dressing like an 8-year-old boy or an 8-year-old girl, for that matter. So a man's clothing, for example, a coat and tie, shows both the authority of age and the authority of a man as opposed to a boy, and the authority of a man as opposed to a woman. So nobody mentions this that I've ever found in the advice books about clothing. Formal clothing is gender specific. Informal clothing is androgynous.
I'm glad you mentioned those 2 points there, because I don't remember the page. I can't remember all your pages in that book, but I do remember vividly reading in the book. And that's one of the parts that hit home with me. The book in general hit home with me, generally speaking. But I recall specifically you said you have to be willing to not, let's say, deliberately insult someone, but if you speak your mind as a man, you're going to insult someone inevitably. And you have to tolerate probably being insulted and being hated yourself. So that really hit home with me. And I do like the fact that you brought the clothing, because I was going to bring up comportment and dress as well. Before we wrap it up, is that even Aaron Wren has mentioned this in one of his recent podcasts. And I actually think that he flat out said that men today, they dress like slobs. Of course, he doesn't mean all men, but if you do look at some of the attire that men wear these days, like you said, it's androgynous, it is boyish. It looks like someone is on in a schoolyard at 13 years old wearing a hoodie and jeans. Now, I think there's a time and place for that, perhaps. Let's say if I go to my son's soccer game tomorrow, I might wear hoodies, jeans, but other times we do have to comport ourselves in a certain way, even the way that we speak and, like you said, dress. And do you think that we should be concerned? I think you'd mentioned in this book, well, you did mention it, but I'm not sure in this context, that we should be concerned with what we consume, even for entertainment, because you said that much of the entertainment that is available to us, and again, I'm always going back to this, even in the 90s, I've told you, is that much of the media, whether it was movies or songs, it seemed obsessive with sexual awakening and rebellion. And even if you look at some of the ages of these performers that still produce this sort of content, whether it is in movies or music, it seems to be focused on those two aspects of life, when those are two aspects of life that I guess should have been done in, I don't know, 14 to 17 years old or 18 years old. What are we going to be, acting rebellious into until our death, so to speak? Would you like to address that?
Ooh, that's an interesting topic, but it's a big one. But you're right. One of the striking things, I'm sure I've observed this in places, well, rebellion, adolescent rebellion, and sexual awakening tend to appear at the same age in children, right? In adolescence. Perfectly well-behaved children can become quite rebellious when they hit adolescence. And they also are undergoing their sexual awakening. Well, what we've come across, what we've invented today is a form of sexual rebellion. Feminism, sexual revolt, combines those two drives, doesn't it? It combines the drive of adolescent rebellion and it combines the drive of sexual awakening. They reinforce one another. In this case, as you say, what's to end into adulthood of this inability to grow up. So you're right. It's a very serious problem. There's something else I was going to say about that, but anyway, let me come back to me. We seem to have hit a formula for kind of hyper rebellion, and it doesn't seem to ever end. It goes on it affects the culture and into adulthood. People who just men and women who just can't grow up. So it affects our culture. We've developed a culture where rebellion is almost a virtue for its own sake these days. Even conservatives claim they are fomenting a revolution, the Reagan Revolution. Like there's this romance about rebelling and being revolutionary, some kind of virtue for its own sake. I'm not sure that's healthy. Somebody's got to stand up and say, somebody's got to be the authority figure. Otherwise, there's no one to rebel against. In fact, I argue in places that this is another role of fatherhood that is actually overlooked, is a father provides someone for a man, a young boy, an adolescent boy and girl, to rebel against. And that gives them an education in how to rebel constructively. In other words, to rebel against someone, I did that against my father. I rebelled against him. But I always loved him, and I came to the conclusion that rebelling against someone we love is good training for loving those against whom we rebel. And I think we've lost that. Nowadays we demonize those against whom we rebel. We treat them as monsters and ogres. No torture is severe enough. But rebelling against your father, a father that you love, Schwartz doesn't mention this, but it seems like an extension of his theory. Rebelling against the father that we love is a way of temporizing, ensuring that our rebellion is constructive and meaningful and not nihilistic, not terroristic, fanatical. And I fear that's maybe what we're moving into. Sorry, I interrupted you there.
You had mentioned earlier in this conversation about vice and how it seems that at different strata, it affects people in different ways. And going back to the idea that Brad had brought up about the quality of entertainment and things of that nature, I think that entertainment, in a lot of ways, is serving as an intentional effort to dilute the influence of the masses and to entertain them into a sort of sedated state in a lot of ways, where men do not have the necessary drive that testosterone would generally provide to them, because a lot of that target of that drive is sated by other sedation methods through adult content and entertainment, video games, these things of these nature. And I find that that's one of the key differentiators in our current society compared to societies past, and our incentive structures are completely changed because of it. And though somebody at the upper crust that has spent more time acculturating virtues and things of that nature, they can enjoy a pipe or a casual drink from time to time, seemingly in ways that people in the lower crust would have a much more difficult time bearing with responsibility. This also leads into the idea of people not being able to disagree without being disagreeable. At the upper crust of society, we can go ahead and have conversations where we have fundamental disagreements about things and still leave the conversation as friends. Whereas in the lower crust of society, oftentimes the very idea of disagreeing with somebody is equated with hatred, as if you hate the person, where we cannot, in a lot of ways, seemingly separate ideas from the person espousing the idea. What do you make of that, Dr. Baskerville?
Well, the second point you made is often said to be a kind of feminine trait. Men can disagree and even fight with each other in military context to the death, and yet they can honor their opponents. And the whole idea of totemism in some ways is honoring those whom you kill or want to kill or have to kill. Whereas women tend to hold grudges longer. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but it's an interesting theory. Your earlier point, though, your first point about the kind of bread and circuses is very interesting. We're sedated by entertainment. We're also sedated, of course, by alcohol and by drugs and by sex. And perhaps it's no it's no accident, as I've often observed in some of my work on political ideologies, that radical ideologies are all puritanical. They demand that we give up sex and alcohol and drugs and pleasures and vanity of apparel and excessive consumption and all these things. And this is not true only of like the English Puritans, but also of the French Jacobins. Lenin was very puritanical in his morality, other Bolsheviks. So maybe we are entering in a period of kind of enforced Puritanism if we have to abstain from sex. This is another, by the way, another theme, if you like, of Republican theory, going back to the early American period, was that Republicanism exalted the manly virtues, and effeminacy was equated with royal courts, excessive devotion to women, excessive devotion to wives, and of course homosexuality. All of these things made men effeminate and seduced them by luxury and consumption and home life. So maybe with MGTOW and men being forced out of the marriage market, forced into a state of celibacy or asceticism or even Puritanism, maybe this is a good thing. Maybe it'll drive men to a more Spartan lifestyle, which is what men need to put away the bread and circuses and the consumption and the drugs and alcohol and sex and start assuming their responsibilities. Just a thought.
It's a pretty strong thought. I think that men would be well served to go ahead and put away a lot of the bread and the circuses and take up their responsibility and make a mark in the world, no matter how small that impact might be at a given level of competency.
Yes, I agree with that. Every man doing his part within what he can do, what he's capable of. But if you get most men, theoretically, we would like all men to agree with us and do what we're saying. But if we can make a mark here and if we can encourage other men to do the same, hopefully others, you have your channel, you're doing your part, we're trying to do our part, everybody else here, Paul Elam, Janice Fiamengo, Roger Devlin, everybody's trying in their own way to get this moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and I think it's really important for us to go ahead and band together as men and to seek to amplify each other where we can and to not quibble too much in public about our differences. I think that that's one of the great dangers of the modern influence dynamic that we're in our society, is that people are very quick to cut down others and their ideologies in support of their own, even if they are just a few degrees difference in terms of their central aim. That is a lesson that we ought to take it at heart, is that we are much better off agreeing on the areas of core agreement rather than trying to cut each other off at the kneecaps.
You're right about that, because even as I've discussed with Stephen before, we have some people that we would like to interview, or some people we have spoken to who have, let's say, views that are politically incorrect or unorthodox. But I am someone, I think like a man, as we're saying here, that I'm someone who can put aside someone's off-putting ideas or other beliefs that I do not agree with, but still say to myself, well, what is he right on? What does he bring to the table anyway? What areas can I work with him in? So I agree with you. I believe that someone expresses some off-putting thought and we dismiss the man totally. I don't do that.
I think that's a reasonable thing. It seems like we're getting ready to wrap up. I just have one thing that I really want to go ahead and thank Dr. Baskerville for. And you might think it's a joke, but I'm genuine when I go ahead and say this. I appreciate you teaching me more vocabulary. So I found that I had to go ahead and look up the French term for a police officer. It taught me a vocabulary word that I had to go ahead and look up for a period of time, was the term for a French police officer, gendarme, that you used several times in the book. Like, I've never seen this word before. Okay, let's go ahead and figure this one out.
No, I appreciate you say that, because this book actually inspired me to think of other works that I should be reading or what I should introduce my son to. Going back even further into the conversation, why this area is very important to me and this book is important to me, because when I was growing up in the middle class or lower middle class, this was reading sophisticated material was really not stressed much at all. I think I missed out on that. I went to a very crowded, overwhelming high school, and things like of that nature were just not stressed. So that's why I really appreciate the book.
Well, I'm glad. I had a fairly relatively privileged upbringing in what was still a good school system, and I had parents who at least encouraged me to learn. I've tried to give others the benefit of that. That's the best we can do, I suppose.
That's what the book gave me. The book gave us that benefits. Many other men who have bought the books. Before we wrap up, where could people find you again?
Awesome. So my YouTube channel is at The Heroes Forge. And you can find me on YouTube and find me on X. Those are my two primary platforms. And I love to go ahead and help to develop men to bear the responsibilities that we each have and to help them to be better husbands, better fathers, and better members of society.
Oh, yes.
Well, great. Thank you. I want to thank you for the very perceptive, intelligent questions. This has been an interesting session, a bit of a role reversal for me. But
yes, I think it was a great discussion because it was mostly about action. That's what we need more of, I believe, in this commentary here in the men's spaces. Thank you for being with me today. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you want to get more commentary on men's issues and sexual politics. Thank you for being with me today.
Thanks for having me, gentlemen.